Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's meeting of Rother District Council's Audit and Standards Committee. Joining remotely this evening, we have Councillor John Barnes, our Vice Chairman, who will leave his camera on during the meeting and will be able to take part in any debate. However, he will not be able to vote on any matter. Duncan Ellis, the Interim Chief Financial Officer and Deputy Chief Executive, is also online and will likewise be leaving his camera on throughout the meeting. We also have Darren Wells, our External Auditor from Grant Thornton, joining us remotely. He'll be presenting his audit plan to us at agenda item 7. In the chamber this evening, we have Anna Everett, Corporate Programme and Improvement Manager, our ex officio member, Chair of the Council, Councillor Vicky Cook, and Lisa Cooper from Democratic Services. Welcome to everyone. Before we start, I intend to bring in item 7, our external auditor's plan, forward between items 4 and 5, so that Darren Wells may leave earlier than he would otherwise have expected. So, moving on, minutes. Item 1, minutes of the 19th of June. May I sign them as a correct record, please? Thank you. Thank you. Agenda item 2, we have apologies from Councillor Chas Pearce. Do we have any others, please?
No others, Chairman.
No, thank you. Agenda item 3, there are no additional items. Agenda item 4, disclosures of interest. I'll come to Councillor Thomas first to see if he's going to do his usual, as possibly the housing company might get.
As Chair of Rother District Housing Company.
Thank you. Any others? No, thank you. So, as promised, Mr. Wells, if you're ready, we'll move to item 7, the Grant Thornton Rother District Council Audit Plan. This is being presented remotely by Mr. Wells. Mr. Wells.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good evening, members. So the audit plan sets out for you those key areas that we need to communicate to you. It summarises the results of the audit planning. It highlights, it starts with the context in which you operate and therefore in which we are auditing you. It highlights the key risks where we will spend most of the audit effort. We call those significant risks. Typically, they are areas of significant judgment, such as the valuation of property, plant and equipment, or the valuation of investment property. And there are also a number of standard significant risks that auditing standards require us to consider. So the assumption that management would override your system of control and misreport the financial statements. That might seem unusual in a public sector environment, but the auditing standards apply to both commercial and public sector, so we have no choice but to consider that risk. We set out for you in the plan our approach to materiality, and that's important because it drives both our approach to sample testing and also our approach to reporting issues that we find back to you as a committee. And we also set out for you the work that we're doing on our second key responsibility, which is the value for money arrangements. You'll be aware that the National Audit Office's Code of Audit Practice requires us to consider your arrangements across 3 areas: financial sustainability, governance, and arrangements to ensure economy, efficiency and effectiveness in the resources that you have at your disposal. And we set out in the audit plan the outcome of our risk assessment and the work that we're going to do. And then the rest of the audit plan highlights those other elements that we're required to report to you: audit fees, our independence, and a confirmation of all of those matters that the auditing standards say we should bring to your attention. And the final thing to say is that the audit plan is the output of the risk assessment, but it's a dynamic risk assessment. So even as we undertake the main substantive stage of our audit, we will keep our risk assessment live. And if we find that there are key changes that we need to make to it, we will do so, and then report any such key changes back to you when we're alongside reporting the outcome of the audit. That's all I was going to say, Chair, but I'm happy to pick up any questions that members may have.
Thank you, Mr. Wells. Any questions starting in the room first? Councillor Thomas.
Yes, thank you, Chair. The first question I'd like to ask just relates to two opinion statements. As I understand it, the reason why you investigate the management override is prioritised because it's been raised as a national issue. But basically, that's the reason why you followed that up, as I understand it. Now, this also applies to pension fund liability. In relation to pension fund liability, you state that there's not a significant risk of material misstatement, but in connection with the management override, you call it one of the most significant assessed risks of material misstatement. I'm curious why you are so convinced that the second one is not a material risk, you're not equally convinced the first one is. Could you just say a few words about those judgments, please?
Thank you. It's through you, Chair. So you're absolutely right. The first risk, the management override, it's a mandatory consideration set out in the auditing standards. So we undertake work to ensure that that management haven't misreported, and that's principally through looking at manual journals that would have been made from which the financial statements are derived. For the second risk, the pension liability, unless I've made a mistake in the drafting of the audit plan, what I think we've reported to you is that the pension liability in itself is a significant risk, but we've then focused that risk to say that we think the key area of the risk is in the assumptions that the actuaries undertaken and made, and isn't in the data that's been provided to the actuaries. So we're trying to focus our effort looking at that significant risk of the pension liability.
Thank you, Mr. Wells. Any other questions? Councillor Biggs.
Good evening. You value for money weakness. You actually talk about reserve funds. This year, or 23, 24, they're going to have another 2 million coming out of reserves, and we're falling dangerously close to our 5 million minimum. How worried are you about that?
So, thank you. Through you, Chair. So we reported the findings of our assessment of your arrangements. I think it was earlier this year to this committee. It might have been in January, and that was for the 21-22 audit. And we highlighted the position as far as financial reserves were concerned at that point. And we said, whilst we didn't consider it a significant weakness at the moment, at that point in time, we did say that you were on the cost, but we were aware of efforts that were being made to minimise either further draw on reserves or to seek to replenish the reserves.
Chairman, there's a very bad echo on the line. Has Councillor Biggs left his microphone on?
Yes, sorry, it's off now.
Thank you. That was causing me to hesitate as well. Thank you, Councillor Barr. So that's what we reported quite clearly to you as part of our 21-22 work. What we're highlighting here, we're picking up that risk again and recognising the budget that you've set for 23-24, recognise your starting point in setting that budget for 23-24, and we want to explore that further. to determine really if we are truly worried about your financial sustainability arrangements or not. So that will be the purpose of this year's work.
Thank you, Mr. Wells. If it's any comfort to Councillor Biggs, I understand that although the forecast was the use of 3.3 million reserves, for various reasons we've only done 1.5 million. So it might look a little better when Grant Thornton come to look at it for this year. I'll come to you in a moment, Councillor Thomas. Councillor Barnes has got his hand up. Councillor Barnes.
I think Darren's just answered my question. It was on page 14 you identified a local issue, and then there was no comment later on. So you are intending to actually carry out some kind of desktop investigation, are you?
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Thank you. Don't forget to put your hand down, Councillor Barnes. Councillor Thomas.
I repeat my declaration at the beginning, Chair of the Housing Company, because this question relates to that. On page 23, you've got a section on the lack of capital project monitoring tool or template. And in that section, you say, it's quite a long quotation. Management confirmed that the intended use of these assets, specifically the land in Blackfriars, has not been steady, depending on the best use at a point in time, and will also depend on the viability study undertaken by the housing company. It is therefore crucial that decisions on stages of the plan of the asset is maintained, which should also outline the outcome of decisions, actions to be taken, and timescale. We recommend that management's valuation team is well aware about the decisions for these assets, but it is important that the concrete plan for the assets are demonstrated not just on the final stage of approval, but also in the form of a tracker showing the decisions made, planned and or alternative actions, and timescale on which these will be achieved. And I want to ask you, to what extent are you satisfied that what you've been able to see demonstrates that what you had set out here as what should happen actually has been what has happened, bearing in mind that the original plan was that the loan agreement for the housing company would come for approval to the board of the housing company on the 13th of February 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, through you, Chair. So if your principal question is how assured are we? Well, at this, as we report or recalled on that page under the column for assessment, we haven't completely closed this recommendation. So what we've recorded in the update on the actions column is our latest understanding, and that's reporting that management have begun the progress. We need to come back to this recommendation to say whether we think the matter has been sufficiently addressed or not. And we will do that as part of the substantive audit work when we start in October.
Thank you, Mr. Wells. Any other question? Mr. Farmer.
Mine's really followed on because I noticed that it says in that action summary that Grant Thornton has mentioned that the recommendations are still being implemented. So my question really is of management. I assume Duncan is listening as to, have we got a date when that implementation will be completed?
Thank you, Chair. Evening, members. We're working on a range of improvements in terms of the housing company and the Blackfriars project specifically. We've had a number of reports through to SLT. We've had a recent report through to Cabinet, which will be going through to full council next Wednesday night. And we're also talking about bringing another report forward in the autumn. We've got a number of boards, governance boards and improvements boards that have been set up as well since Darren and his team will have looked at the accounts last year. There are a number of liaison groups now at both officer and member level, and further and more detailed ongoing conversations with the housing company. So I think there are a range of governance improvements that Lorna and various other officers within the council have actually implemented. We've also, as you'll probably be aware, got an internal audit ongoing in terms of the Blackfriars development. There will also be an internal audit in terms of the housing governance arrangements coming forward in the autumn. So I think we have already implemented a range of improvements that are ongoing, and I would expect that we would continue to improve and develop those as time progresses as well. So I think we will be in a far more positive place when we get to the audit and when EY look at the position in October. There are lots of things we're doing to try and improve all of those things, because I think we've accepted going back a number of years that those things weren't in place necessarily. So we're trying to make sure that all of that is strengthened.
Thank you, Duncan. Before I come to Councillor Thomas, just to follow up, in any councillors looking at their diaries, the next full council is next Monday, not next Wednesday. Councillor Thomas.
Thank you. And thank you, Duncan. I think I'm very well aware of the improvements that have been made in the way in which the housing company has been handled, and all the things that you said. I'm very, very grateful to you for putting forward those improvements, and I'm very, very pleased with the way in which that aspect of the housing company is being handled. Nevertheless, there is one criticism that I do think is important to make, and that is that the Council makes a great deal in documents we're going to consider later on this evening about its transparency and openness and the extent to which it works in a partnership way. But I just want to put forward a complaint. I'm sorry about this. A complaint that the document that was prepared in connection with the housing company was one that the housing company wanted to have sight of before it came to the Cabinet. But in actual fact, it wasn't completed until a few days beforehand, and the housing company had no opportunity to actually put an input into that document, although I think we made it clear we wanted to. And we're not making a suggestion that we should contribute to this in any sort of hostile or confrontational or competitive spirit, but because I think that we could have improved that document. We could have maybe corrected one or two inaccuracies. We might have been able to make some useful suggestions about how the actual policy and presentation of the issue could have been handled. So in other words, we would like, as a company, please, to be much more involved. There's talk about partnership, and I'd like to see that partnership really actually coming to something. So it's a real thing and not just a slogan, please. So in future, please, when there's something involving the housing company, can we be a party to the discussions around it? That's what I'd like to ask, please.
Thank you, Councillor Thomas. Obviously, Mr Wells, you realise that was not aimed at you, and it was aimed at Mr Ellis. I think we'll take that up at another time as well, actually, out of the meeting. Just before I come to Councillor Biggs, Councillor Barnes has got his hand up again. Councillor Barnes.
Yes, I'm prompted in a sense by Councillor Thomas. I'm not expecting an answer tonight, but it does seem to me that because we're the committee responsible for monitoring the housing company, and I do know that Duncan intends a great deal more transparency and indeed clarity around the way we monitor our capital expenditure. But what I'm less clear about is who is going to audit the company if Darren is auditing our transactions with the company. And how do we keep track of that, or do we not have to?
Thank you, Councillor Barnes. Mr Ellis, I think that is again one for future discussion. It may be that the housing company is responsible for auditing itself and that we're responsible for auditing our part. But yes, thank you for that, Councillor Barnes. That's been noted. Councillor Biggs.
Yeah, this is for Duncan. You said stuff's in place now for the Blackfriars site and things are going well. one of the things that was recommended was a tracker to show different stages of decisions held for these assets. Is that in place?
I'm not sure what the expectation was from EY in terms of a tracker or whether we've got a dashboard in place. We are developing dashboards so that the authority can see very easily and very clearly where we are in terms of these key projects. But what I would say is we have taken, it's like the report we've taken through Cabinet and some of the updates to SLT, and just taking Councillor Thomas's point that we are trying to work more closely with the housing company in partnership, but I'll take those comments back, Councillor Thomas, in terms of that specific report. But we are documenting those changes and that progress as part of our wider corporate governance improvements and project management improvements. We're looking to implement gateway reviews. So if you look at some of the bigger organisations and some of the bigger capital schemes that go on across the country, you'll often find something called a Prince 2 methodology that is used for big projects, but part of that methodology is complex. I don't think we need to employ that for all of our projects here, but one of the fundamental things that methodology does is to force reviews at certain stages of projects so that you take a step back, you review the business case, you review the intended outcomes, you review the costs, all of those benefits, and only if it all still stacks up to you then go to the next stage. So that's what we're doing now with those housing company papers and discussions. And we are taking that project forward. I've mentioned to several committees as well that we are doing that more widely across the capital programme, because we'll touch later on in terms of the Treasury report about the increasing PWLB borrowing rates and the impact that's potentially having on the viability of some of those capital programmes. So the boards that we have established, we have a board that's now going to be looking at all of those big capital projects, and that stop-go check will be in place across all of those schemes. So there is a documented point at which we say, yes, we have assessed all of these things, yes, we're happy to progress, or no, we shouldn't progress at the moment because there's too much risk. So yes, those things will be in place. And like I say, I don't know if Darren was specifically thinking about a dashboard type approach, but I think we've got the fundamentals of that, and we are building the dashboards at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any comment on that, Mr. Wells? Because if there's no more questions, we might be moving on.
I don't have any comments on that, Chair.
Yeah, thank you very much. Any more questions for Mr. Wells? In that case, thank you very much, Mr. Wells. We're now going to just deal with this report. I believe the receipt of this report needs to be noted. So can I have a proposer for noting it, please? Councillor Thomas, thank you. And a seconder? Councillor Gray. Agreed? Yes, yes, yes. Yes. Anyone against? Anyone abstaining? Thank you. That's noted. Thank you very much, Mr. Wells. Good evening.
Thank you.
Right, back to the agenda, proper order, item 5. This is for us to recommend to the full council that the term of office for our independent person, brackets, Rose Durban, extended by a further term of 4 years to December 2027. I don't know if Mr. Ellis wants to comment on this. I think it's fairly self-explanatory. But I don't know, do you need to say anything on this, Duncan?
No, I don't think so, Chair. Like you say, I think it's fairly straightforward, so I wasn't planning on saying anything.
Yeah, thank you. It was just in the interest of Lorna Ford, whose report it was. So I think I shall just open it for any discussion. And if nobody looks like they're going to discuss it, I'll move on to a vote. But Councillor Gray.
I was just going to recommend accepting it.
As nobody wants to say anything, I'll accept Councillor Gray as proposing this recommendation to full council. Seconder? Thank you, Councillor Biggs. All those in favour? Thank you. That is carried. Thank you. Agenda item 6, annual report of this committee to full council. Before I call on Duncan Ellis, I should probably steal some of his thunder by just saying a little bit myself. This report on the audit side of this committee's functions came out of the self-assessment, which we'll be discussing later, item 10. We have previously reported annually on the standards matters that come before us, but this is the first time that we're reporting the audit work undertaken by this committee. This is very much our report, and so changes can be proposed and discussed this evening. If we do agree changes, I'll then be seeking authority for Duncan Ellis and myself to begin delegated authority to make those changes in accordance with your wishes, because this report will be going to full council in September. So having stolen all of your thunder, Duncan, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, there's not a vast amount for me to add. I suppose the report does give the opportunity for the committee to raise its profile with other members and indeed full council, because ultimately this will go through to full council in September. But as the Chair says, there is an opportunity for you to discuss this report tonight, and if you feel that it needs strengthening or changing in any way, we can make those changes in time for full council in September. So that's all from me at the moment. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So the matter is open for discussion by anyone? Yes, Councillor Thomas.
Can I ask, is there one person who is responsible for seeing that audit recommendations are carried out? Because it just strikes me there's so much that's good in all these reports, so much that could improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the council, and yet obviously there's often a slippage in terms of actually implementing the suggestions. And I'm just sort of wondering whether if you had one person who was clearly the one person who had to drive forward all the recommendations of the Audit Committee, they would probably be implemented a great deal more promptly and effectively. So is there any consideration being given to that idea, or does that already happen?
I suspect that falls to me, actually. And we'll be coming, again, that touches on our self-assessment and the recommendations in there, but I'll let Duncan tell you it's not my responsibility. Duncan.
No, I think absolutely the role has the committee has a really strong role to play in that, and we've had lots of discussion, I suppose, over this issue over recent months, and the committee has recommended, if you remember, where we had the longer term outstanding recommendations, that actually some of those service managers come to committee to explain direct why those things haven't progressed. I think one of the other improvements I've tried to bring in since I've been here is that Gary now comes along to SLT with the long outstanding issues, so we can discuss them at SLT. We can try and bring pressure to bear, because some of those are not necessarily within our gift internally. Some of those we're relying on partners. Some of those improvements we're relying on other people. So we can bring some further pressure to bear to bring those forward. Ultimately, I suppose the Chief Executive is ultimately responsible for delivering those improvements, but actually in terms of accountability, you have the service managers identified within all of those audit reports as being the ones that need to deliver directly. So there are improvements there. You'll notice as well, we've got the AGS, the annual governance statement, on the agenda tonight. And one of the things I've listed in terms of improvements on that AGS report as well is to make sure that we keep on top of internal audit recommendations and that we progress them in a timely manner. I think part of that conversation as well is being very open and honest with ourselves as an organisation when we talk about resource availability and capacity, about when some of these things can actually be delivered. I think what officers have a habit of doing is trying to do everything immediately, and some of the things are quite complex. They're difficult to deliver. Obviously, if they've been raised as an internal audit issue, the internal auditor feels they are significant and we need to address them. I think sometimes officers try and put too much pressure on themselves to actually deliver them when those timescales aren't realistic. But we do need to keep a handle on that. So that's why, like I say, we've brought those issues to SLT. The chair has a direct independent meeting now with Gary. Also myself, I have a monthly meeting with Gary. So there are a number of things that we are bringing forward in terms of governance improvements to try and strengthen that position as well.
Thank you, Duncan. And you'll also see, Councillor Thomas, on the agenda item 10, one of the suggestions is that I have a regular meeting with the leader of the council as well. But Councillor Thomas.
Come back on that, Chair. Firstly, I'm not sure that there is too much pressure to actually do things too quickly. I think, if anything, there's a lack of urgency. I think exactly the opposite, actually. And I think that although I can see the advantages of it being done through the senior management team, I suspect that could be tutor thieves. And so that it wouldn't be clear exactly who is the person whose job it is to drive forward the particular improvements. And at a point where we really do need to deal with the extraordinary financial difficulties that the council is in, largely through no fault of its own, I think that these improvements are urgently required, actually, and can make a real contribution towards improving the council's financial position. I'm always interested in the issue, what's the best way to get leverage in relation to this issue? You know, there may be a number of audit recommendations. Which one is going to give us the most leverage to make the council more efficient and more democratic? So I'd like to see a bit more prioritisation within the audit recommendations, but I'd also like to see somebody that Councillor Drayson can meet with who has the necessary authority to actually drive those improvements forward. And I would like to see some kind of dashboard that these are the things and this is where we are with them. I noticed the target dates varied between September of this year and the end of 2025, which sounded quite distant to me, actually. So I do think there is an urgency about this, and I would like to see the whole business of audit becoming much more central to the council's operations, because I think it is the clue to improving the council's performance. So I really want to see this pushed forward as a major priority.
Thank you, Councillor Thomas. Mr Farmer and then Councillor Barnes. Mr Farmer.
I've raised on a number of occasions the fact that this committee, in fact no committees on the council, have any actions arising on their minutes, and they don't therefore have any review of those actions arising at the following meeting, which is standard practice for most committees and governance boards I've ever attended. I raised this on the self-assessment in discussion with Duncan, and but I saw nothing coming back that this is going to be considered. And it seems to me in Councillor Thomas's need to have follow-up is that if an action comes from this committee, it ought to be recorded, it ought to be there as an action arising, there ought to be some response from management as to when it will be addressed, and it ought to be reviewed at the following meeting. That's a standard practice, and I really don't understand why this council, or any council for that matter, doesn't have that policy.
I think we'll come on to that. Bear that in mind when we get to agenda item 10, the self-assessment, whereas this is the report of what we did last year to council. Councillor Barnes and then Councillor McGirt. Councillor Barnes.
Yes, I think Patrick Farmer has said something of what I would have said in reply to Councillor Thomas. But I think the committee really has the role here. I don't think you can put it on any one senior officer other than perhaps the chief executive. But some of the things that Duncan mentioned earlier that we're going to do, like actually asking an officer to report why an action has not been implemented, I think it illustrates just what our role is. But I have to say that would affect the minuting of this committee and the agenda setting of this committee, because we would need to have an agenda item on actions that we requested that had not been carried out. And the minute would have to be very specific on what we had requested. So I'm with Patrick Farmer, and I think really we leave it to you, Chair, to go away and think about this with the officers servicing this committee. But clearly we do need, there have been some very long-standing recommendations that have not been carried out, and we've never had an adequate explanation. And I think this frustrates our internal audit people as much as it frustrates members. The other point I was going to make is quite different. And I apologise to Duncan because I probably should have raised this at the pre-meeting. So if I'm bouncing him slightly, he must accept my sincere apologies. But the more I actually think about our relationship with the housing company, although the performance of the housing company lies with overview and scrutiny, it comes into our remit, partly because it's one of the largest risks that we're actually facing, but also because there is no other body that looks at the relationship between the council and the housing company from a scrutiny point of view. And it seems to me the report doesn't quite capture that. Risk management is very non-specific in paragraph 6, but rather more important, we're not simply concerned with the governance arrangements. We are to some extent concerned with how the arrangements are actually going forward between the company and ourselves. And Duncan will forgive me if I go back before his time, but I used to get very frustrated as the director of the company when I found that the loan agreement, the sale, and the SLA had none of them been implemented, and yet there was nowhere where we could formally raise that, or indeed no way in which it actually got reported to the council that that was the case. We now are greatly improving that relationship in terms of transparency and actions. But reflecting on the past, I think there is something that needs to be said here, which again you and Duncan could perhaps draft, to say we were tasked with actually not just looking at the governance of the company, but actually with monitoring the arrangements between the company and ourselves, and not least because that is actually a sizable risk. As Duncan has more than once pointed out, our capital program is 10 times the size of our revenue program. We spend much more time scrutinizing revenue than we ever do capital. And yet that's where the risks really lie. And the biggest risk by far is Blackfriars.
Yes, very much so. Duncan, comment on that? Because I think we will need to get together and because I brought it up at the pre-meeting. If you remember, I said at the pre-meeting, do we need to say more than that one line?
Yeah, no, I agree. Picking up on that point, absolutely. I think that's something we can strengthen in the report before it goes to full council to outline that. So yes, yeah, absolutely happy to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor McCurt.
Thanks. Yeah, so just returning to the issue of, you mentioned the dashboard, and I think elsewhere in this or another report, I can't remember which report, mentions performance management as an ambition, and wondering if the two things are linked then, if there's a need for more transparent performance management, whether it's a dashboard or whatever it is. Part of that could be an action tracker. And I think it was previously mentioned, because there are, specific actions, obviously, that we're talking about in relation to this report. But it was previously mentioned that there is, the council has a board, so officers have a board approach to managing some aspects of improvement and transformation. And presumably, if these actions that we're talking about here are taken seriously and acted on, they would form part of the programme of Improvement and Transformation Board, which could then report to Councillor Drayson, or in an edited form to this committee. So there's a sort of silver thread, if you like, or a golden thread even, just escalating the importance of the thread. between something along that, if there's a board approach and to this committee, that seems like it might answer the need for greater transparency in performance management.
Thank you. Sorry. Anna Everett.
I feel an urge to volunteer to track those audit recommendations as part of my job, and I agree with everything that you've just said about the transparency of the boards. So as Duncan mentioned, we've set up 2 boards. I think you know all about it. We've got a performance board, which is a senior leadership team-led board, and we've got a new programme board, a senior leadership team board as well. So I think I can, pending discussions with Lorna, happily bring that into my scope of work, and I'd be happy to.
A volunteer is always better than a press person.
I couldn't help it.
Thank you. Did you hear that, Duncan? Oh, he's fainted.
I did, Chair. And that's the thing. We want to improve the focus on the delivery of these internal audit recommendations. So I think the more support we can have and the more visibility they get, then the better. So absolutely, Anna, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I know I made light of it, but actually to have an officer volunteer to come forward and to do some extra work for us is actually quite refreshing. So thank you. We've got a bit of work to do, Duncan. Not too much on doing that report. We will circulate it by email, because obviously we haven't got another meeting before full council in September. We'll circulate it by email just to make sure members are happy with it. So we'll get the first draft fairly soon, subject to holidays, etc. So we need to forward this report to full council, asking for them to note it, for them to affirm the work of this committee and for consideration of any concerns raised in it. I think there will be a couple of concerns once we've rewritten bits of it. And I think it's been said here anyway, so I would like authority for myself and Duncan Ellis to get together and amend the report accordingly. So do I have a proposer for that, please? Councillor Gray. And a seconder? Councillor McGurk. Thank you. All those in favour? That's carried. Thank you very much. I did speak to Duncan after the last meeting. We were trying to avoid one officer repeatedly presenting report after report after report and to vary it. But of course, Duncan is the officer tonight. So moving on to agenda item 8, the Local Code of Corporate Governance and the Annual Governance Statement. Mr. Ellis.
Yes, apologies to the committee that you're going to hear me droning on constantly, but yes, I'm the author of all of these reports. Just in terms of the AGS and the Local Code of Corporate Governance, so the AGS is the Annual Governance Statement, and it's part of the support for the accounts process. So it will be included with the 22-23 accounts. The committee hopefully approved that annual governance statement, and then it's signed by the chief executive and the leader. One of the things I've introduced this year, though, you'll notice in terms of the local code, and this is quite a large agenda item, and I apologise for that, but the best practice framework that SIPFA provide is very, very detailed. What we have done in previous years is stated at a very high level against each of those key criteria that we comply. But what I've actually done this year for the committee and for the organisation is to do the detailed line-by-line assessment, which is best practice. And it does support the annual governance statement. You'll see from the annual governance statement towards the end of that document as well, there are a number of improvements that are recommended, and a number of those improvements have flowed from the review of this local code. So it's an opportunity to review the council's governance arrangements more widely and assess against a number of criteria that are in the framework how we are performing against some of those, and it acts as a bit of an aid memoir and a check to make sure that the various documentation, the various bits and pieces are in place. And if they're not, it's an opportunity for us to flag it and say, actually, this is missing. So asset management plan, for example, or workforce plan, which is effectively a people strategy. There are some of those key documents that I think would significantly benefit the authority that aren't currently in place. So what this detailed piece of work does is try and have a look at all of that from a broader governance context, and then make recommendations as to how we can improve that framework. So those improvements are contained on pages 95 and 96 of the agenda, and that's what's before you this evening, Chair. I won't say any more about that at the moment, but I'm happy to take any questions.
I'm just going to have the first question myself, because part of this is to approve the annual governance statement and then for the leader and chief exec to sign it. Have they already had sight of it and contributed to it, or do they have to sign what we send them?
There have been various review processes. Yeah, it's an ongoing conversation.
Yes, thank you. I just didn't want them to get it and say, what's this? We're not going to sign it. Thank you. Councillor John Barnes.
Yes. I think the committee, first of all, should express their appreciation to Duncan for the amount of work that has gone into this report. I think I now see a document that reminds me of those that I used to see at county, and which we never had, because we never went through this, I think, as thoroughly in the past as Duncan has now gone through it. I think that's highlighted by the gaps he's spotted, which are indicated in yellow, and the recommendations that follow from that. All of them, it seemed to me, absolutely acceptable. So I wanted really to congratulate those who produce this, and I think it is primarily Duncan's work. And really to say how big an improvement this is. I'm not sure new members would appreciate that. So it really behoves us who were on the committee before to say how much more thorough this is and how we can therefore be much more satisfied about the governance arrangements in place. The only thing which I'm not quite sure how one actually recognizes this, given that this is a governance code. But in a way, what Lorna is doing with Duncan on performance management is also a key bit of governance. It's no good having governance right if actually in the end you don't deliver on the policies that you've actually approved. And somehow, thorough as it is, it doesn't quite catch the improvements that are going on in performance management. And I wonder if Duncan could give a bit of thought to that with you, Chair, to see if somehow we can catch that and approve it.
Thank you. Duncan?
Yes, thank you, Councillor Barnes, and thank you for that support. That's very kind. Just in terms of that observation around the performance framework, I suppose what I've tried to do with the assessment is to consider where things are embedded. So when you talk to auditors, whether they be internal or external, they will often talk about governance processes being embedded. So that's effectively where you don't have to think about it. It's something that everyone does naturally, and it's been in place for an amount of time. I think all of those improvements that Lorna has driven forward and we've tried to support with as a senior management team and a corporate leadership team are all fairly new. And when I talk about fairly new, I'm talking about probably the last sort of 6 months. So because this is an assessment for the last financial year, 22-23, I suppose in my view, none of those things as yet are embedded. And what I would expect to happen is to redo the review next year. And because all of the detail work has been done, that review is more than about what's changed, what's improved, what's been delivered. So you don't have to do the whole thing again. That's where I'd then expect to see those improvements coming through. And then I could talk about them in next year's assessment to say this has been delivered and these are the outcomes and this is the positive effect it's had. So that's why it's not really discussed in the look back for last year.
Thank you, Duncan.
Accepted.
Yeah, you may have missed Councillor Barnes' floating thumbs up that came across the screen. Mr. Farmer.
I equally say that obviously there was a huge amount of work Duncan put into that. I have to say it is very hard reading because of the way it's columned. I think new councillors may well have thought shock horror having to plough their way through that and read every word. So it's a very hard read. But more importantly, I think the question I have on the actions you've identified that need to improve the governance situation, how will this action plan be monitored and how will it be reported?
Thank you. One of the things I've been talking to Lorna about, and it comes back to these performance groups and the dashboards, is that as an authority, we have a large amount of separate reports and separate recommendations that go to all sorts of different committees. So the internal audit recommendations are probably the most straightforward ones because they will all come through you. Gary keeps an eye on them. He flags when they are behind. So you've got oversight and a handle on those all of the time. There are lots of other bits and pieces. So Darren was speaking to us earlier, obviously, in terms of the audit plan for the 22-23 accounts. The value for money assessment makes recommendations each year. And in the past, those haven't really been captured anywhere. So they are in the audit report. They'll come through to this committee, but actually they don't then feed through to Gary in terms of Gary monitoring them because Gary's not monitoring external audit recommendations on value for money. He's doing internal audit. We've had the peer review recently. So again, that produced a report that had recommendations. And one of the things I've been discussing with Lorna is how we capture those wider recommendations, whether they be from external or internal, because there are other internal recommendations. This report that we're talking about now, and it's an absolutely brilliant point in terms of the monitoring. So in the past, the AGS would have come through you, you'd have approved it, it would have had recommendations for improvements on it. But actually, it would be very easy for the visibility of those to be lost. So we've been talking about how we capture all of those. So again, I've done a piece of work recently that looks at all of the recommendations across the whole of the council from all sorts of different sources. And that's where Anna and her team as well are going to be instrumental in being able to support that visibility and that transparency of those so that we can capture them in one place and so those timescales as well can be monitored. And as officers, we need to be held to account. We need to be delivering those things where we can, as far as possible, within those timeframes. Because as several people have said tonight, they're all important things and we do want to deliver them. So that performance framework and the dashboard is going to be a way of trying to bring all of that together, because at the moment it's all very disparate and it can go to lots of different committees through lots of different reports. So that is something we are trying to pull together. I don't know, Anna, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I don't know if you've got anything to add on that.
I'm glad you mentioned Anna, because I was going to be looking at her, giving her an opportunity to volunteer for something.
Well, I think I'm going to volunteer for something else now. It definitely sits with me to monitor all of that. It's part of the improvement work, and we should be able to monitor it at either our senior leadership team meetings or the performance or the programme and project board. So I think we can bring that in with the work that I'm doing.
I'm so glad you came this evening, because at least you know what's coming your way,
Yeah.
and you're not just getting it tomorrow morning from Duncan. Thank you. Mr. Farmer.
I think I understand that will be the monitoring, but will we get a report back to this committee?
I think that will need to be the discussion in terms of how those things feed through, and it relates back to the comment that was made a little while ago about the performance and how it all links in with the board. So I think I can't see any reason why, once we collect that information, it can't come back. I suppose we'll have to have a conversation as to whether this is the right committee or overview and scrutiny potentially, but it could be both. But if you think about wider recommendations, all of the internal audit stuff comes through you, so I don't see any reason why we couldn't do a summary report back to this committee. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I was thinking perhaps a 6-month review or something, so we don't clog up with a work programme with regular ones, but we need to know, because we're back to the comments that Councillor Thomas made before about keeping track of internal audit recommendations as well. Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Thomas.
Can I thoroughly endorse all that has been said by Mr Farmer and Councillor Barnes about the excellence of this section of the report. Most impressive. It summarises all the sort of gaps in what the Council should be doing. It then assigns each of those to a particular member of the Council to do something about it. I think that's an extremely good move to make. And it seems to identify practically every single major thing that has been picked up in previous audit reports. I think it's an amazing piece of work, and I'd just like to add my congratulations to all the other people who have said that. I would like to just stress something that doesn't get mentioned very often, but is mentioned there, and that's where it says on page, I think it is 59, there are no procedures in place to capture and share positive feedback and compliments, and this should be considered along the complaints process. Because I think that would change the whole feel around management if we could put a much greater emphasis upon positivity and praising people who do well. And that's, I think, one of the most important features of what you've written here. And I really would like to highlight that, because I think it's really important. Then there's another point I'd like to highlight, and that's bearing in mind that most councillors are, in fact, backbenchers. That's what we are. We're backbenchers, really. And there's one section about the powers of backbenchers. I was unaware of this power. I don't think it's ever been utilised, and that's on page 91, where you say the Local Government and Public Involvement and Health Act of 2007 includes powers to enable councillors to champion local issues where problems have arisen in their ward. The council has embedded, that's a lovely word, has embedded the councillor call for action, which allows councillors to ask the discussion, its overview and scrutiny committee, on issues where other methods of resolution by the district member have been exhausted. Now, I'm prepared to say, I wonder whether anybody in this room knew of the existence of that power or of that policy, and yet it does seem to be a way in which the average member of council can make a difference to their own individual ward. And so I just would be very interested if you could expand on that. I'd be interested to know the scope of that measure, the kind of subjects it could apply to, what the procedure is, and whether it could be publicised more. It seems a really interesting idea, and I think it's worth highlighting. So I'd be interested to hear a bit more about it, Duncan, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you.
Thank you again. Thank you for your feedback on the work that's been undertaken. That's very, very kind of you. I think in terms of this specific area, I think it's probably useful if I do you a written update to the committee, so that you know what the procedure is, what sorts of areas there are, because obviously we can put certain things through full council in terms of call for action, but I think this is something separate and something that's complementary to that. But I'll have to review the constitution and just double check exactly how that works here at Rother, and then I can put something forward to you all to give you that higher level of detail, if that's okay, Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Duncan. I chaired the sort of review of the constitution, and it doesn't ring any bells with me. Perhaps it might with Councillor Barnes. Oh, one moment. One moment, John. Lisa Cooper's going to...
Just to say, Chair.
Yeah, Chairman. Sorry, I'm getting an echo again. The call for action is a natural extension of the call-in system, which does operate, and overview and scrutiny occasionally employs it. Going back to performance management, the first people, in a sense, to whom the report should go, obviously is Cabinet. They are the people who are responsible in the end, not only for taking the executive decisions within policy, but really the individual members and the collectivity should actually be monitoring delivery as well. Our job is to scrutinise whether that's being done effectively. And I don't think it matters if there is a slight overlap between ourselves and overview and scrutiny. But the important thing is a report needs to be made in Cabinet on performance delivery and whether there's any shortfall. And we should scrutinise that and indeed take independent advice, if necessary, from internal audit.
Yes, thank you, John. I wouldn't disagree with that. But your thoughts, Duncan, before I come to Lisa Cooper on the Constitution question?
Yes, I mean, I agree that that role sits with Cabinet in terms of that overall performance management, but there is obviously a role for both overview and scrutiny to oversee that performance, but also yourselves as a committee. And that's why I think potentially that 6-monthly update that we talked about might be particularly useful for you as a committee.
Yes, thank you. Lisa Cooper.
Thanks, Chairman. I was just going to say it is within the provisions of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee to consider councillor call for actions. It is in our constitution. I can certainly point you to the right part and circulate that to members. But it is really a last resort when all other methods of resolving something in your wards has not worked. So it's not something that happens often. Okay.
Thank you. Councillor McGurk.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't know if my question is related to that. I think it might be. But it was in relation to the report. Just join in on the praise of the report. But and it was really clear. I like the points of, and I'm talking about the sort of governance, the rules of governance table that you've done. The second point, ensuring openness and comprehensive stakeholder engagement. I was interested in page 56, where it describes, it's highlighted in yellow, that there's a need for an enhanced comms strategy, communication strategy, and also a partnership framework. And I'm just thinking about some of the opportunities to engage realistically with communities, with our communities, and I'm thinking about things like co-production, appreciative inquiry, those kind of means of engaging with communities where, you know, where words like, or terms like consultation are overused and misunderstood and often misapplied. So it was just a plea really for us to really genuinely consider that as a means of engaging and working with communities and helping to give communities a voice. And beyond that, the real role that councillors, I mean, talking about myself, I don't want to volunteer colleagues for things that they might not necessarily be interested in, but I think councillors have a really crucial role to play in that kind of genuine engagement with communities. We have a unique engagement with an understanding of our communities, and would love to be involved in those projects if and when, as and when. That was my point, to really include members in the development of common strategies and partnership framework wherever possible and wherever members are willing to do that.
Thank you. Councillor Biggs.
Hi, Duncan. Being a newly elected councillor and new to the audit committee, reading the 126-page report was a bit of a wake-up call, I must admit. There's some questions, in not a derogative way, but I don't know what they are. On the review of effectiveness, 4.2.13, the accounts and audit, It says no audits were completed during 22-23 financial year that received a good assurance rating, which is the highest level you can get. 10 out of 15 were given a substantial assurance. However, 5 audits received limited assurance, namely procurement, capital programme, property investment, community infrastructure level, and the toilet cleaning contract. So can you tell me how we go about improving them, or what is there stuff already in place for that, or how does it go about?
Yes, absolutely. So each of those audits will have come through to this committee. I'm conscious of the fact that you won't have seen any of those reports, but every committee, and I just keep calling him Gary. Gary Angel is our chief internal auditor, but he and his team will bring through all of those reports to this committee, and each of those reports will have a set of recommendations. So when you look at that list on there, each of those has had recommendations for improving that position. So because they were given low assurance levels, there will have had to have been that much more work to bring them up to a level which Gary and his team will find acceptable, and you as a committee will find acceptable. So that's where Gary will continue to monitor those recommendations. Where they start to miss any deadlines or where they become longer term outstanding issues, again, those will now come back to the committee, and the committee prior to the elections were talking about getting those responsible officers to actually attend committee, like this evening, to give an explanation as to why, if those have been outstanding and not delivered, what the reasoning is behind that. So yes, each of those, the important bit off the back of an audit review is those improvements, and the improvements in governance, the improvements in terms of delivery, and improvement in terms of outcomes. So there will be a set of recommendations against all of those reports, so they will all be ongoing. And in terms of that list, I know there are a number that have been delivered and completed and signed off by Gary. But that's how the process will work, and this committee has a really active role in keeping a view and an update on all of those.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to say, the theme through tonight, of course, is keeping updated with all the things that people have said they're going to do, have promised they're going to do, their recommendations or in actions, and it's a common theme tonight. And I welcome it because actually the committee are obviously wanting those replies and they want those answers. So I'm actually quite positive from the comments that have been made tonight. Any other questions on the annual governance statement and the local code of corporate governance? No. Well, in that case, there's 3 parts to this resolution on this one. The first is to approve the local code of corporate governance and the improvement actions contained within them. Then to approve the annual governance statement, and then accordingly for the statement to be signed by the leader of the council and the chief executive. I'm going to take all those 3 as just one resolution. Can I have a proposer, please? Councillor Thomas, thank you. And a seconder. Councillor Gray. Thank you very much. All those in favour? Thank you. That's carried. Thank you. Right. Item 9, Treasury Management Update Report. This would be Ola Janovic, but she's having a well-deserved holiday. So guess who it is? Mr. Ellis.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just briefly take you through some of the highlights of this report. Hopefully some of this will be more accessible now that we've done the training, treasury management training earlier today, so thank you to all of those who were able to attend that session. But this is on pages 99 to 108 of the main agenda. So the committee will receive quarterly updates throughout the year, and I think it's important to note that actually that reflects best practice. So when the Prudential Code changed last year, it made recommendations for this new financial year that these reports should be quarterly, and you as an authority were already doing that last year, so you're already ahead of the game with that, which is positive. This is the final report for 22-23, so it looks back over last financial year to assess performance against the various indicators that we set. The numbers are draft, so they are part of our 22-23 account, so technically they are still subject to audit. but I wouldn't expect any of them to change. So just in terms of investments, we've got a total of just under 21 million invested at the moment, 13 million of which is in short-term accounts, so generally overnight, and we've got 8 million pounds in pooled property funds, which is covered under paragraph 3, and we've had those for a number of years. The interest we received last year from all of those investments was just over £1 million, and that was slightly higher than we anticipated when we did the budget monitoring at Q3. The split of income is shown in paragraph 4, and then there's more information within Appendix A on the total investments and the various institutions that we've invested with. Just touching on borrowing, we've borrowed about 32 million, so that was the same figure as at Q3. Due to the current economic climate, in relation to borrowing, construction, material costs, capacity constraints, the capital programme hasn't progressed at the speed we initially anticipated. So it's doubled in terms of spend from the previous financial year. So I think we spent around £24 million last year, which was double the previous year. So we're recovering from COVID when the programme more or less stopped. So the delivery is increasing, but that was around £150 million less than we anticipated spending. And there are a number of reasons for that. And when you look at some of the indicators, they reflect that slippage and that slowdown in delivery. So our capital requirement, our capital financing requirement is the amount we forecast we need to borrow to finance our capital programme. So if you ignore things like capital receipts, and we predicted that was going to go up by 76 million because of the fact that the capital programme, about 2/3 of it is supported by borrowing, and actually that capital financing requirement only moved by 18 million, again because of that slippage. Some of that slippage is around the reviews that I've already spoken about this evening. So taking a step back from some of those schemes, revisiting the business case, making sure we can deliver those outcomes, trying to mitigate some of the risk, because with the size of the capital programme, the level of risk is compounded when you've got so many big schemes. So some of that slippage is actively saying, hang on a minute, so much has changed, we need to take stock and review, and sometimes that does take time to do. So I'm not surprised there has been some slippage there. There's also non-treasury investments that are discussed within the report. So you've got previous property portfolio that the authority had, and you've got the property investment strategy. So that was a strategy to try and invest in assets that had regeneration potential, but also potentially could generate income. So we generated around £2 million, just over £2 million from those property investments. And the investments we've made, particularly around the property investment strategy, are covered within Appendix D. I suppose the only final comment, Chair, in terms of the economic position is the fact, yes, there's a plus side to the interest rates increasing in terms of our investment income. The downside of that is borrowing rates, which have fluctuated between 5–5.5%. And only 2 years ago, July 2021, we could borrow from the Public Works Loans Board for under 2% for 50 years, and we're now several percent higher than that. So that puts a strain in terms of the cost of delivery of some of those capital schemes on the budget, because obviously we have to fund the interest costs through and make provision to repay the loan through the revenue budget. So the two are connected in terms of capital spend and interest. And we're obviously impacted, and there's an ongoing issue around the Ukraine war, highest inflation for 40 years, uncertain government policy around future funding for councils, which means it's difficult to project in terms of the medium-term financial strategy what our funding position is going to be. So all of that economic outlook does make the Treasury management position significantly more difficult in terms of forecasting cash flow and understanding what's coming in and when. And when you have a capital scheme of £150 million plus that might go on for 4 or 5 years, again, projecting those cash flows forward is very difficult, but we are focusing on that area and improving it, because if we can get better at that, it'll help minimise borrowing costs, it will help maximise the amount we have available to invest, which in turn brings in more additional income for the bottom line of the council, to support frontline service delivery. So that's all I'll say at the moment, Chair, but as with the other reports, happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I have one question. I suppose I should know it really. Page 105, the bottom line, the Blackfriars borrowing of 5 million is due to be paid back in June next year. How is that paid? I mean, you mentioned about repaying from revenue. How will that be achieved? Because it was only a 2-year loan, wasn't it?
Yeah, the timings of those loans, so there's various loans being taken out at different times from different organisations. So if you're looking particularly at that table, the majority of that borrowing was taken out at really good rates, as you can see from the PWLB. The Blackfriars was funded by another authority, so I've talked this evening about inter-authority lending and investment. So not only can we lend money to other authorities, but also we can borrow off other authorities, and it's often at a lower rate depending on when it's taken out than we can achieve through the PWLB. The downside of the local authority investments is that it tends to be shorter term, so 2-3 years is probably the maximum we're going to be able to do. But we make provision within the budgets to make those repayments and to pay that interest. So all of that will be part of our cash flow management processes. But that was taken out short term to access those low rates to get us over a cash flow issue, because some of the other areas we can look at, you might have heard us talk previously about internal borrowing. So rather than going out and borrowing from the market or the PWLB, we can potentially use our surplus cash balances to temporarily fund investment or revenue spend, because we do get a cash flow benefit being the authority that collects in everyone's council tax. So obviously we collect on behalf of the county council or the town and parish councils, police and fire. We're the billing authority, so all of that money comes into us, and then there's a delay between us getting the money in and paying it out to the major preceptors. So over those couple of weeks that might be in our accounts before it's paid over, we get a cash flow benefit from that, and we're able to invest that or use that potentially to fund some of these schemes. So it's around using internal funds that are available rather than borrowing wherever we can. But there is provision made within the budgets to make sure we can repay those things. But it's all taken account of as well in terms of the cash flow modelling. So when these things are due to be repaid, they'll be reflected in the cash flow, and it might flag another requirement to borrow for capital purposes at that point, but we will always try and minimise. So even when we do have a scheme that we assume will be 100% funded by borrowing, if we were to sell another asset that generated a capital receipt, for example, of £2 million, it would be more beneficial for us then to apply that £2 million to the capital scheme and only borrow the balance, because the borrowing costs would be far higher than the invested money and the capital receipt. So we will always try, in terms of the Treasury management position, to maximise the value for the council taxpayer. So we might have a view as to how we'll fund something, but actually when it comes to the time we need to fund it, we will look at all of the options available to us. And as you'll have seen from some of the figures in this report, we thought we were going to be borrowing vastly more than we have, tens of millions more, and we've not had to do that yet. So it's an active, ongoing review that we will continue to do to help finance the programme, and as well, slipping the programme or pausing the programme for certain schemes, looking at alternative delivery methods, again means potentially we won't have to borrow. But part of all of the management arrangements around Treasury and part of the role of the committee is to make sure that whatever we are doing, it's prudent and it's affordable. So when we come back to those Treasury management indicators that will be in the reports coming forward to you over the coming months, it's those sorts of things that the report will be highlighting, and you'll be able to check that we are within the thresholds that we've set ourselves. So hopefully that's helped.
Councillor Barnes.
Tempted to observe that Sinker Valley, the master juggler, has nothing on Duncan. he's described, and I think brilliantly described, just how varied you can be in how you cover your borrowing costs. But the problem is how you keep track of this. And the point is again illustrated in paragraph 4 of this report, where we're now counting in, it's good news that the loan agreement has now been reached with the company. We're now counting in income from that. But of course, somewhere else in the books, we will be actually paying out to help them finance that, because the company at the moment has no income. And that's true of the borrowing too, although technically that loan will be repaid by the company. In practice, it's going to be repaid by us. So I think some quite serious thought is going to have to be given how we actually monitor that relationship with the company, my earlier point, because a lot of these bookkeeping transactions will cancel each other out in terms of our real position. And although the loan will be secured by a debenture on the assets of the company, at the moment, without income, there is no real way we're getting real money from the company. And yet, quite rightly, we show it in the accounts as income, and then somewhere else we show an outgoing. But from our point of view of monitoring, that's going to be quite tricky to monitor.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Barnes. I hope that might be addressed with some of Duncan's comments earlier about trying to make things much clearer and much more traceable for councillors in the various reports. Duncan.
Yes, absolutely. We talked earlier in the training around how we can make some of the reporting and some of the budget reports clearer and giving more of a breakdown. So what we have had a tendency to do in the past in some areas is to show a one-line net position, but that net position can include borrowing costs, interest, income returns from investments. So what I propose to do in terms of the medium-term financial plan and the budget reports is to make that more transparent, to break some of those things down so it's clearer and easier for members to see what is actually going into those lines to make the net position. And I think that will be helpful in increasing that awareness and that understanding. Yeah,
thank you, Duncan. Just before I come to Mr Farmer, of course, for Councillor Biggs, it might mean that the 126 pages become 150 plus, but there we go. Mr Farmer.
Thank you. My question for Duncan really is on the property fund. I suspect at the time that the council invested in the property fund, property was a very stable investment and looked like it would grow. Unfortunately, life changes, and we're now in a situation where I think property is something that people would think twice about investing in. Prices are dropping. At the moment, the government has allowed us to ignore the fact that we have a loss, a potential loss against that fund. I suspect if the market continues as it looks like it's going to, this potential loss will continue. A, it means we won't be able to sell this fund for some considerable years, I suspect, without taking a loss. And B, if the government changes that policy, we will have to recognise that we have a large potential loss against that investment. I wonder if you have any comment on that, Duncan.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. So, sorry, there's a lot of feedback again. It's your. Yes. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. In terms of at the moment, what we'd describe any increase or decrease in a fund against what you've paid for it, we'd talk about that as being a paper loss or a paper gain, because until you actually sell that investment, you don't crystallise that loss or gain. But as I'm sure Tony will have spoken to you all previously, there has been an override in terms of these property funds are termed as pooled funds, and there has been a specific override put into local government accounts so that position that Patrick has just described doesn't impact on the council tax payers. But that override at the moment, it's called International Financial Reporting Standard number 9. At the moment, that override is only in place until March 2025. So you're absolutely right. The government could at that point say, we're not going to have that override anymore. And what that would mean was if the fund showed, for example, a £250,000 loss on paper at the end of the year, we would have to either use reserves or some other means of filling that potential void in the budget. And it probably would be reserves. My recommendation to the authority would be if that override looks like it's not going to be continuing, and I don't know why central government didn't make the decision at the time to make it a permanent thing, but they didn't. I would suggest that we have some sort of treasury management volatility reserve, because that way you would be able to smooth out those fluctuations. And like I mentioned a minute ago, at the moment, it's only a paper loss. There is, because until you sell that investment, you don't crystallise the loss. But actually, if they continue to reduce in value, that's something we need to keep an eye on. The positive side of it is they still create a really good revenue income source for the authority at the moment, even though the overall capital value has reduced. And you'll see from the report that it's fluctuated quite a lot. And I've been at authorities where they've had significantly more pooled funds. And that's why when we talk about that sort of medium to longer term position, that's what we'd always recommend in terms of funds like this, because they are more volatile. But normally over the medium term, they would recover, but we are in a very difficult financial situation at the moment, so we will need to keep an eye on those and keep them under review. But they do produce a good return, and at the moment that statutory override is positive in terms of the council's position, but that could change in the future.
Thank you, Duncan. Any further questions for Charles? No. Right, thank you. This report is for noting, so can I have a proposer, please? Councillor McGirt, thank you. Seconder? Councillor Hayward, thank you. Agreed? Yes, thank you. That's agreed. Thank you, Duncan. Right, agenda item 10. This is Mr. Ellis. It's a self-assessment that we undertook March 23. And again, I'm possibly going to steal his thunder. I think this was a very useful exercise that the old committee did in preparation for this new committee. Now, we haven't really discussed the skills and knowledge framework that's included there. And I was going to suggest perhaps later in the year we have an informal meeting to discuss that and to discuss our own skills and knowledge. And on this one, this is very much, again, it's our report. We can change some of these improvements, suggested improvements, although many of you might not know what it's improving. But we can definitely change the timescales in there. For ease, Duncan has put in September 23 for most of them. The odd one's December 23, I think, and one's March 24. But while we go through this, we can realistically, or discuss with Duncan, a realistic timescale for some of these. So I hope I haven't stolen your thunder, Duncan. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. No, I suppose I'll just add it represents best practice. So in terms of continual improvement for the committee, it's recommended that we do this on an annual basis. So that's something we can put in place in terms of the work programme. You'd ordinarily do it around February if you have a meeting scheduled in there, and you do a review of the previous year just to see where you were in terms of the actions you suggested last time. And then if there's any that haven't been delivered, you can take those forward. But also you'll do that self-assessment again, where you take a critical look at the work of the committee and see then if there's any further improvements you can make. And I think the session you've suggested, Chair, in terms of the skills framework would be really good. So there's an opportunity there for potentially further development and further training. There's an opportunity for members to assess themselves against that framework. There are things you can do online. There's lots of resources available on the internet in terms of developing some of those skills and understanding. And Lisa and her team have done an amazing programme in terms of the member induction programme. And when you look at that framework, actually lots of the things that Lisa has been providing for you, although they might not be under the umbrella of audit committee training, they're actually really relevant to that. So I know you've had sessions on finance, you've had sessions on risk, you've had sessions on internal audit, and all of those things will help to build your knowledge and your understanding and your confidence in terms of being on this committee. So yes, that's the piece of work we did together. Absolutely happy if you want to change any of those recommendations or the timeframes. You'll note when you look through some of that schedule that actually some of the things we've already delivered. So the annual report, for example, was an action from that piece of work, which is on the agenda this evening. So there are some things that we have already done. Doing that self-assessment is part of the improvement which we've done and we've scheduled already for next year. So again, Chair, I'll leave it for you to discuss the actions and those timeframes. Thank you.
Yeah, and I doubt if we can get Anna Everett to volunteer for this, because we'll have to make sure we keep up with our own improvement plans and nobody else. It's down to us. At the moment, I've got no members indicating, so I'm actually going to ask.
Chair, you've got someone on the screen.
I know, that's what I'm just going to say. There's no committee members yet, although one has just said. So I'm going to ask Councillor Cooper, to speak first, and then we'll come back in the room.
Thank you. It was just to clarify, is this just for this committee, or should all members submit their skills audit?
This is just for this committee. I suspect other committees might want to copy us.
This has before. It's useful because I'm a school governor and we have to do this every year. We have to submit our skills audit, our backgrounds, our experience, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, that hasn't actually been asked of me. And I'm obviously not part of this committee. I was just watching and listening, and I thought, oh, my ears pricked up. I'm quite interested in this. Do you think other committees will follow suit, or could it be a blanket across all members? Because I think it would be useful to know members' experience and skills.
What committee are you on, Councillor Cooper?
I am on licensing and scrutiny.
Well, there's two committees that might be adopting it. One moment. Lisa Cooper's got something to say. One moment.
Just to comment that previously at the council we used to do a skills audit. All councillors were required to fill out a skills audit form. We collated that information and we provided it back to group leaders for their information. We actually took that to the Member Development Task Group at the last meeting to see whether they wanted to do it again this time, and the decision was no, because they didn't felt that it was used by the group leaders and the group leaders should know the strengths and weaknesses of their members. So that's where it is at the moment. We don't intend to do a council-wide skills audit. This is really specific to this committee.
Thank you. And it probably is more useful for the committee to discuss it between themselves and to know each other's knowledge and skills, rather than the leaders possibly have a list of all their members. And so we'll carry on doing it, Councillor Cooper. It's up to you if the others do or not. Mr. Farmer.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Chair, to sound like a crack record, but my issue on actions arising in minutes, you referred it to this item. You said it's more relevant to this item, and I fed it back, but it doesn't appear anywhere in this report.
No, I still think it fits in here somewhere. Well, no, the whole idea is about this feedback thing. I think we're going to have to undertake to discuss it, because we talked. I mean, I made a note here about a red, amber, green sort of list without any big details, but I think perhaps we need to discuss this, Duncan, with also Democratic Services, as how we could achieve that agenda-wise, if that's the feeling of the committee as a whole. I'm getting the feeling from the flavour tonight that actually it is, and the committee want to know what's happening with things they've said in the past. We're not going to solve it now, but I wonder if that is something we need to discuss. And Lisa Cooper's finger is hovering over her button.
I was only going to say it's not normal standard practice for local authorities to have matters arising and or sort of feedback on actions from other meetings as a sort of a standing item. You could have a report on that, but it couldn't just be a verbal update on the agenda as far as I'm aware. But I'm certainly happy to do some more research and come back to that and discuss it with the Chair and Lorna, see how we take that forward.
I think that's the best we're going to get, Mr. Farr, for tonight. But I very much I take your point because I know, but there's definitely a flavour tonight of what's happened with X, Y, and Z, and none of us know.
I don't see, Chairman, why we shouldn't be an innovator occasionally.
You rebel, Councillor Barnes. Right. Now, I mean, it would be silly because of Duncan's comment that we have adopted some of these. I'm almost tempted to go through it a recommendation at a time, but we'd be here forever. I have to trust that members have read it. And I suppose my only concern was about the time scales. Now, it's a bit like sticking your finger up in the air, isn't it, to see which way wind's blowing. And I wonder if we perhaps should leave these timescales, bearing in mind we haven't got a meeting now till then, that we leave these timescales, try to achieve them, and feedback on the actions and how far we've got at the next meeting, rather than sit here going, well, I think that should be October, I think that should be November, because there could be reasons why one thing doesn't happen and something else actually gets done within 2 weeks. So I think, are there any questions first on any of these items? And I will commend, actually, I know it's a big up Duncan Day, but he has taken the brunt of tonight's meeting. But actually, I'll just come to you, John, but actually this was his gift to us with his arrival at this council, as well as other things that we've mentioned tonight. And I thank him for it because it actually really concentrated our minds as to what we were doing. And we actually didn't give ourselves bad marks, if you see in the second chunk. I keep going low and I kept getting talked up. So, Councillor Barnes.
Yeah, I think we need to do the skills audit as soon as possible. It's quite tricky because, of course, sometimes you have professional qualifications, but quite a lot of us have got a bit of experiential learning, which hasn't ever been formally assessed. And probably we shouldn't miss those skills, but they do need to be recorded slightly differently, I think. But the earlier we do that, I think the better, because we can then identify what training needs we have as a committee. On timetable, I think you're absolutely right. What would be useful is some feedback in the autumn, whether these timescales still look to be appropriate. And the last thing we need to do is to record somewhere which ones have been carried out.
Just stop stealing Mr. Farmer's thunder, will you? Yes, we'll do an action report back on the actions. Yeah, thank you, John. And also, of course, on the positive thing is we may be crossing out a lot of the September ones because they've actually happened or are well on the way to happening. But I take your point there very much, John. Thank you. I'm trying to remember what your first one was. It's gone. What did you say first, John? Oh, the skills audit. Yes. I'm very much thinking of a physical, actual meeting so we can chat amongst ourselves rather than online. We will get some dates for that. and a mutually acceptable point, although I must say 4 of us are from Bexhill, so you may lose out there, John. Councillor Biggs.
Yeah, will that be before September the 23rd? Because look at this here, September the 23rd is quite prominent of what we should be doing and should have done it by. And personally, my recommend, for me, I don't know if I'd have that done by September the 23rd. I mean, I said to you, I've put an email out about an informal meeting. If we could have that, then perhaps discuss what's on here. It's how the councillors feel.
I suppose it wouldn't be wrong. I mean, the self-assessment was very much an informal meeting to do it. And equally, we could include a review of this with the skills and knowledge framework in an informal meeting. And get an update on that. I mean, it's the month of September, it's not the 23rd, because we're not meeting till December, but it would be nice to have...
It says September 2023.
Yeah.
I've got that one wrong.
But it would be nice to have some of them in place. But Duncan.
I was just going to say, Chair, I wonder whether a pragmatic solution, because you'd be looking to achieve those, when you do your annual review normally, you've got the next financial year to implement these changes. And bearing in mind this is the first time we've ever done this with the committee, the first set of recommendations, what we could potentially do is to say that all of those recommendations there we will try and deliver by March 24. So we'll try and deliver them in this financial year, rather than worrying too much about individual ones being September and then some in December. And then if we can deliver them earlier, and we know we've already delivered some, I just wonder whether that might be a pragmatic place to be.
I can see nods around the room, Duncan, and on the screen as well. So, yes, we'll amend it that way, but not to take our foot off the pedal, because we still want some good news in December, at December's meeting. Right, thank you. So this was, in addition to noting the report, we've been asked to agree implementing the improvements identified within it and the agreed timescales, and I think we've just agreed that the timescales are all March 24, but to be achieved as soon as possible.
Except the skills audit.
Yes, except the skills audit. We'll get that one sooner rather than later. I don't know how we feel about transgressing the there shall be no meetings in August. It could be early September. Yeah.
Early September might be more sensible.
Yeah. Okie dokie. We'll do that. Thank you. So we need a proposer for this resolution. Thank you, Councillor Gray, and a seconder, Councillor Biggs. Thank you. All those in favour? Thank you. That's carried. Right. The work programme, agenda item 11, the work programme. So I've written here myself in October the skills, and hopefully, having just said that, we can have a little brief update or something in the October meeting, or at least confirmation that we've done what we've just said we would do. And the other one is an extra meeting, I would say, somewhere. It could be informal again. It's when we do the next self-assessment. As Duncan just said, he suggested it's in February. Well, of course, we don't meet till March, which is a bit late in the day to do it. And it would be nice if we did it in early February, because then we could actually discuss it in March's meeting. So I would suggest we put into March's work programme a review of the self-assessment when it's been typed up and made to look pretty. I'll come back to you on that in a moment, Duncan. John. Councillor Barnes, sorry.
Right. We haven't really settled how we're going to scrutinise the housing company, and we have a role there, and there's nothing in the work programme on that. I haven't got a specific suggestion, but it seems to me you and Duncan need to discuss how we're going to scrutinise, what we're going to scrutinise in terms of the housing company, and probably fit it into one of the lighter agendas.
When you say lighter, I think you're looking at October, unfortunately. But yes, Duncan, any observations on that? I think we're going to be quite busy meeting.
Yeah, I think we can have a chat about that, and when we can fit it in, have a look at the work programme, see what we've got in there for September, because we'll have the draft accounts coming through. There's some fairly weighty items that will be on there. So yeah, I think if we can get the chair to discuss that, we can have a look at the programme.
Yeah, it may be, Chairman, that we schedule a specific meeting for that, because there may be matters of commercial sensitivity. So it may be that it shouldn't be altogether a public meeting, which is why, in a sense, I'm happy to leave it to you and Duncan to discuss how this is best done.
Thank you, Councillor Barnes. That's a good suggestion about having a specific non-public meeting to discuss that, because it will be commercially sensitive. Councillor Thomas.
Now, I think we have to be a little bit cautious around this, because we have been warned by our solicitors that we have to be very careful as a company that we maintain our non-contracting status. And so I think we have to be aware of the legal position when we talk about the way in which it's to be supervised. I would prefer this issue to be discussed within the broad questions of governance of the company and the relationships between the council and the company. And I think there are various mechanisms which have been evolved for dealing with that and bringing it to members' attention. But we have to be very mindful of taking the right balance between, on the one hand, allowing the company to have the proper degree of autonomy that a commercial company legally must have, and the right of councillors to ensure that the principles on which it works are those which are approved by the democratic members. We've got to get that balance right. And so I don't think it would be right to sort of make a decision about how this should be done. I think it should be discussed by Duncan and other members of the council. I think that would be the right way to go about it. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you.
Because we do have to be very mindful of the legal position.
Very mindful of that, and also your comment earlier about the previous report where the company was not consulted about the report.
That's right, exactly.
But I'm thinking, if nothing else, Duncan, it's always easier to start with something and change it. So I think perhaps Duncan and I start the ball rolling and perhaps then consult with the company about how it's going, because we can't tread on the company's toes, but we have to protect the councils.
Exactly. We've got to strike exactly the right balance. Then that's quite a delicate matter, and I think that needs to be borne in mind. But the company will be bringing forward its own business plan for consultation, and I believe that the Overseas and Scrutiny Committee, obviously my interest in foreign policy gets the better of me, a committee is going to look at the actual future of housing, so that the whole issue needs to be discussed by the council. But I think it's really important to say it's the job of the councillors to determine the basic principles on which the company operates. But it's not the business of the councillors to interfere with the actual operations of the company. So we need to be very careful.
Heard loud and clear.
Yeah. Can I agree, Chairman, with Richard Thomas, that what this committee must not try and do, nor indeed overview and scrutiny, is to become the board of the company. That is not our role. But there are various pairs of spectacles with which we should be viewing the company. We are not the shareholder, but the cabinet is presumably operating as the shareholder with the chief executive. Our problem is making sure that the company is financially robust and in a fit state to deliver, because we are concerned with risk as a committee. We are the major scrutineer of risk. And just as I would look at all our other investments with that in mind, that's the pair of spectacles that I have on, not those of trying to take decisions for the company, which are for the company themselves.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Barnes. Yes, as I said, that was Councillor Thomas's message was received loud and clear. We might be meeting for all of August this way, Duncan. Any other comments on the work programme, adding anything to it? I suspect we're going to put a couple in from what we've said, but to be decided when. Lisa Cooper.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to say I've got a couple of reports to put onto your December meeting for standards reports. Earlier this month, the LGA has published a report which outlines how councils can better support councillors to prevent and handle abuse and includes principles for councils to consider, top tips and good practice case studies. So we'll be bringing a report forward on that, and also looking at a dispensation policy. Now we have a new code of conduct, we do need a dispensation policy. So those two will be coming to December's meeting. Thank you. The LGA, is that connected to Debate Not Hate? Yes, as a result of that report. Thank you. Any other comments about the work programme? No? Right. Well, sorry. I thought I heard some of them. It was right, okay. With that, I will close the meeting at 8:21. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance tonight. Thank you, Duncan, for your contribution. Thank you for Anna for volunteering for things you didn't have to volunteer for. And thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you all. Night.